Welcome back. Now that exercise was done with the intention to get you to become slightly familiar with a process, a particular way of thinking, which would probably be quite unfamiliar for most people. The open eye exercise was done with the intention to teach you a process probably more formally referred to as compartmentalization, which is basically where what we do is we take a problem that we're stuck on and then we kind of zoom out and we look at the relevance or the relative size of that problem to everything else and then kind of shrink it down or dissolve it. Because what frequently happens in our mind when we get stuck on something is we do overwhelm or we overgeneralize it, or we blow up the problem to make it seem much bigger than what it actually is. And quite often the solution way of thinking is to start sort of breaking it up or to shrink it down and to see the reality of how small it actually is by comparison with everything else going on around us. Now, the closed eye exercise was firstly to get you familiar with the process of mindfulness and observing yourself without judgment, to observe yourself in a way where you could create a personal boundary between the outside world and the inside world, and also to become familiar with the process of being able to give yourself love and compassion, understanding and support, and all the things which we would ordinarily kind of unconsciously seek from the outside world, quite often to our detriment. The reason why that ability, that skill of self-communication and self-acceptance, the reason why that is so important is because the absence of that ability can be found at the heart of just about every problem you can think of. If you had 100 different people and lined them up and examined 100 different problems, okay, from codependent relationships, anxiety, depression, alcoholism, addictions, anger, frustration, you name it, okay, you'll find all these different variables among them, but the one kind of the constant, okay, the common denominator among all of them comes down to an inability or a lack of ability to provide oneself with that self-reassurance and self-communication. And so as a result, they're seeking those feelings by looking elsewhere and doing some kind of self-destructive behavior almost as a substitute or replacement for the ability to provide oneself with that reassurance and that self-compassion. In fact, if you were to learn that process, which is a learnable skill, then what will happen is after a while, once you can give those reassuring feelings to yourself, what tends to happen over time is the way you feel towards those problems that you previously had is that you just kind of get bored with them. It's like you just don't need them anymore. If you took somebody that was addicted to something, gambling, drugs, alcohol, you name it, once they learn that process, then they just don't feel the same way about that problem anymore. They just don't have the same drive or desire for it. And so whilst learning that process and thinking about communicating with ourselves in that way might be new and unfamiliar compared to most people's usual way of thinking, you can actually practice doing that. And like is the case with anything you practice, over time with repetition, when we practice doing something, we become much better at doing it. We can get to the point where we can do it easily without even having to try or think about it. In fact, I'd like you to think about it this way. When we do something with repetition, we are practicing it whether we do it with conscious intention or whether we're just doing it unconsciously. But the problem becomes when we practice doing something, usually unintentionally, that is problematic for us. So say, for example, let's say you were a worrier, okay? You were a bit of a stress head. Well, chances are you've probably practiced doing worry, probably weren't aware that you were doing it or didn't think of it as practice, but you've probably done it with so much repetition that you've become really, really good at it. Okay, you've probably become an expert worrier. In fact, if you do it with enough repetition, you could probably worry without even having to try. You could probably worry without even realizing that you're worrying. In fact, you'd probably worry even when you're trying not to worry. That's just how unconsciously competent you'd become. So in that sense, think of psychotherapy as being very similar to physiotherapy. You know, if you went to a physiotherapist, they wouldn't just do something that would help you in the session. They'd also give you some exercises that you can go away and practice that will help you strengthen and heal and grow in between sessions as well. So that brings me to the next topic, which is what's the difference between psychotherapy and life coaching? And it really just comes down to the way that you look at it, because psychotherapy, I guess, is more like seeing a physio where you're injured, so you go along and learn how to do some exercises to heal and strengthen those injured muscles. Whereas life coaching tends to be, in that sense, a little bit more like seeing a personal trainer. There's not necessarily any obvious wounds or injuries that need to be healed. People that see a life coach tend to be a little bit more future focused, whereas people who see a therapist tend to be, whether they're aware of it or not, a little bit more past focused. So somebody seeking a life coach might feel a little bit intimidated by talking about the emotionally sensitive stuff that a therapist might talk about, whereas somebody that wants to see a therapist might feel a little bit intimidated about talking about success and goals and the future-oriented stuff that somebody who sees a life coach might want to talk about. But here's the reality that I'd like you to become aware of now, which is that there's only so much benefit to be gained by looking at the past. Okay, if we only ever focus on our pain, on our problems, on our limitations, it kind of robs us of the ability to create a much brighter future for ourselves. Okay, there's a sense of satisfaction sometimes to be gained by exploring the past and kind of figuring out what went wrong back then that kind of explains why we are the way we are today. But the reality is that the past is over. Okay, it's beyond our control. And even though our problems may have originated back there, the reality is that our solutions only exist in the future, because that's the only thing we have control over. Now, I know that trap. I've fallen into it myself, as do many people. However, the other trap that I've learned through experience, and the trap that a lot of people who seek coaching fall into, is the idea that if I can just make my life better, if I can become more successful and achieve my goals, then I'll feel better about myself. And I need to make my life better around me so that I can feel better about myself. And so people that go after life coaching often are a little bit too future focused and just want to talk about goals and success, and they sort of err away from the more uncomfortable or vulnerable emotional stuff that might be more commonly discussed through therapy. And so either way, if we only ever focus on one without the other, what we tend to do is it's kind of like skipping leg day at the gym. Okay, we strengthen our strengths, but we keep our weaknesses weak. And the thing that I really like you to become aware of now is that it's in our ability and our willingness to strengthen our weaknesses that will set us free from being stuck and going around in circles on the problems that we've been trapped in. The obvious problem with focusing on our weaknesses, of course, is that it can feel intimidating at first or uncomfortable, but it's kind of like when you're a kid going to get a needle, you know, the way that we'd sort of blow it up in our own minds is to see it as being a lot worse than the actual experience really is. So in that sense, focusing on our weaknesses, it can feel a bit like having to see a doctor to get some surgery done on an area of flesh that's really painful and inflamed. Okay, we're extra protective of those more vulnerable bits. And that's where the appeal of clinical hypnosis comes in. Clinical hypnosis, in that sense, can kind of be like the anesthetic that can take the edge off that pain long enough to be able to heal the wounds, so that way we can break free of the problems that have been keeping us stuck. I think you'll find there's great value in gaining a strong understanding of how hypnosis works prior to actually seeing a therapist, because there's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about how hypnosis works. The first and most common misconceptions come from people's experience or exposure to stage or performance hypnosis. Now, while stage and performance hypnosis can be entertaining and is a really fascinating and interesting example to demonstrate the psychology of group compliance, it's not actually hypnosis. Okay, it's kind of hard to explain how stage hypnosis works, but this is the best way to think of it. Okay, do you remember back when you were at school as a teenager in the early years of high school, and you kind of started to notice that everybody sort of started to play along and pretend to be into certain bands, music, fashion styles, kind of to the point where they'd almost convinced themselves that they actually really liked that music or that band or that style of clothing, purely so that they could fit in and gain the acceptance of the people around them. Okay, do you remember a time when you were a teenager when there was a really popular song that came out and you kind of convinced yourself that it was really actually a cool song and you really liked it, only later when you grow up and then you look back and you realise, actually that was kind of silly. And you realise that you basically just sort of convinced yourself at the time that it was really a great song for no other reason really than because everybody else around you acted as though it really were a great song. As a general rule, I think most people massively underestimate the power of the psychology of group dynamics and group compliance and the extent to which people will convince themselves of something for no other reason than to satisfy an instinctive need to fit in with a group. And that's basically what's happening on the stage. Okay, the hypnotist will give certain compliance instructions and the people who are not complying as much will be kicked off the stage. And that's like, those kids don't fit in, so they're not cool enough, off they go kind of thing. And it frightens the remaining group into just becoming more convinced. Okay, so that's a really kind of fascinating example of the power of group psychology, but it's certainly not clinical hypnosis. It's not therapeutic in any way. Once the mind realizes that there's no longer any social gain by believing that it's a chicken or whatever it is that the belief is, once the mind realizes that, there's no need to go along with that anymore, then it becomes like when that song isn't cool anymore, and it's like you suddenly go, oh, okay, yep, no, there's no lasting effect, in other words. So whilst it's entertaining, it's certainly not in any way, shape or form therapeutic. So what is hypnosis? Well, hypnosis is essentially a state. Okay, it's a state of mind. Now you can be in all sorts of different states of mind. You could be in an angry state of mind. You could be in an excited state of mind. You can be in a miserable state of mind. You can be in a happy and excitable state of mind. Okay, there's all sorts of states that you've experienced. Well, hypnosis is a state. It's a state of relaxation, but a more profound kind of relaxation than what you would ordinarily experience when you're just feeling relaxed because you're sitting at home at night watching the telly. Or you're in a waiting room staring at a nice aquarium or some similar situation like that where it's an ordinary form of relaxation. And now the aim of achieving that profound state of relaxation is because in that state of mind, you're much able to gain a perspective on things that you would not ordinarily be able to see. Let me give you an example. Have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to solve a particular problem and you're concentrating furiously on it? You're thinking very intensely about this particular thing and you can't seem to find the solution. So then you kind of go away and you have a break. You might even give up on it completely and you go and have a swim, go sit in a nice warm spa, have a nice warm shower, or even just have a rest, go to bed. And as you're about to drift off to sleep or you're in the middle of having a nice warm shower, whatever it is you're doing, suddenly that's when all the ideas start flowing in and you have to jump up out of bed or jump out of the shower and start writing down your ideas before they sort of dissipate out of the back of your mind. See, when we're in this closed state of mind, when we're concentrating intensely and we're exerting a lot of mental energy, we become really good at identifying problems and seeing, negative things that may be very good for our well-being and our safety, but we become very bad at seeing sort of outside the box. We become very unable to find solutions to those problems. We are much better, however, at seeing the solutions to problems when we're in a much more relaxed state of mind. And so hypnotherapy is a combination of focusing on the problems and identifying clearly what the problems are and then learning the process of allowing the mind to relax and go into that profound state of relaxation so that then the solutions start to be able to flow in more freely. Now that you have a clearer understanding about what hypnosis is, the most commonly asked question is, can I be hypnotized? The first thing I'd like you to become aware of when it comes to that question, can I be hypnotized, is that nobody can be hypnotized because nobody can hypnotize you. Okay, hypnosis is a process that nobody can do to you, but instead can teach you how to do for yourself. Okay, so in that sense, think of the hypnotherapist as kind of being like a driving instructor. You've got ones that can be clear and concise and can make you feel safe and comfortable learning how to drive very quickly in a situation that would ordinarily be kind of stressful. But likewise, you've got ones that are not very clear and not very encouraging that you just keep crashing as a result of their instructions. So recall how I said that I'm just the navigator, but you're the one in the driver's seat of your own mind. So the question is not can you be hypnotized, but can you learn how to do hypnosis? And so the second thing I'd like you to become aware of when it comes to that particular topic is that once upon a time, they used to think that certain people, certain personality types could be hypnotized and others could not. And the way that they would establish that is by getting a bunch of random people, getting them to sit down with a hypnotist, and the hypnotist would do the exact same thing to every single different person. And what they'd find is that some of them would kind of go into a trance-like state and gain some value from it, and the others, it wouldn't be the same for them. And so they assumed, therefore, that because some people could do it first go, therefore those people could do hypnosis and the others simply couldn't. But what we now understand is that some people can simply learn to do it very quickly, and for others it just takes a bit more practice, that's all. There is, however, a great irony here, however, and that is that if you're the kind of person that can relax very easily, you can kind of just be yourself in any situation, you can kind of let go and just interact with strangers very easily, you can kind of go with the flow, you're probably the kind of person that will be able to do hypnosis very quickly. You are probably the kind of person that would sit down with a hypnotist and boom, just first go, no problems at all. And that's fantastic if that is the case for you. However, if you're the kind of person that is prone to doing a lot of overthinking, or you're a bit over analytical, you're used to concentrating deeply, problem solving, or if you're the kind of person that does a lot of worrying, or is prone to anxiety and doesn't find it necessarily that easy to relax, or if you're the kind of personality who doesn't find it very easy to trust people, or you don't open up to strangers very easily, or it takes you a bit longer to get to know someone, or it takes you a bit longer to be able to sort of wind down and relax. Or perhaps if you're the kind of person who grew up in a household that was very strict, where there was a lot of really strict and almost frightening rules about how you must be, and you felt kind of terrified to be anything other than how you're supposed to be. In other words, there's a whole bunch of reasons that might explain why you might need a bit more practice in learning how to do that process of relaxation compared to other people who might be able to do it really easily first go. The great irony is, though, that if you fall into that second category of people who are prone to doing overthinking, overanalyzing, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety, then you actually have more to gain by learning how to do hypnosis. But the irony is that you're also, unfortunately, more likely to fall into the trap of being the kind of person who might go along to a hypnotherapist and it doesn't work straight away because the therapist doesn't necessarily explain this process that I'm explaining to you now. And so because it doesn't work for you straight away, you walk away thinking, oh, well, I must be the wrong personality type, or I'm beyond help. My problems can't be solved. It doesn't work for me. So the reality is that anybody can learn to do hypnosis. The irony is, the more you probably need to do it, the more it's going to be a struggle for you. So that just means that it becomes more important for you to learn the process and to practice doing it a bit more so that you can gain the most benefit from its effects. So if that is the case for you, then you've most definitely come to the right place. So let's look specifically at that process of how you can learn to do hypnosis. Well, the first thing I mentioned was that all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. So in that sense, it's kind of like going to a club and getting up and dancing. There's a certain aspect of responsibility on your part to kind of allow yourself or give yourself that permission to get in the mood and enjoy the music. Obviously, if you're in an environment where they're playing music that's really good, that you like, it's going to make it a lot more easy for you. And so with that in mind, that's why it's super important that you find the therapist where you're going to feel a greater sense of connection, a greater sense of trust. You're going to understand what they're explaining to you and feel that they understand you. That's like going to a club where they're playing the music you already like. So it's a lot easier to get yourself in the mood to go along and have a bit of fun with it. Now, different hypnotherapists will use different approaches to elicit that profound state of relaxation. They should really adapt it depending on what's going to work best for you, but usually it'll include something fairly similar to what we did in that closed eye exercise, where you become more internally focused, more relaxed, more aware of things like your breathing, and sort of slowing down your mind and becoming less concerned about all the racing thoughts through your head and become more centered and more focused on the sensations in your body. Okay, it'll be different for different people, but that's usually the role that the therapist will start to play to get you into that more relaxed state. However, the self-hypnosis part, the part that you can play, all comes down to how your mind chooses to respond. So during that process, when the hypnotist is giving you instructions and you're thinking about the things that they're telling you to think and you're imagining what they're telling you to imagine, inevitably during that process will be moments where certain thoughts will pop into your mind. Okay, it's inevitable. And the most powerful moments will be where a thought related to self-doubt of some form will pop into your mind. It may be something like, oh geez, I don't know if I'm doing this right, or oh geez, I've been swallowing, or I'm itching, or I'm feeling uncomfortable, or oh geez, I don't know, this is taking too long, I don't think this is going to work, or something along those lines. Some thought that pops in where you think, oh, I don't know if I can do this, I don't know if this is going to work, I don't know. Okay, there's some kind of uncertainty that just pops in. And the pivotal moments that enable your mind to actually go deeper is when you notice those thoughts and you respond back to them with a permissive response. So the trick is that it all comes down to those split-second moments, those pivotal moments in time where those thoughts of self-doubt that just impulsively react, they just pop into our head. They come from the unconscious, okay? But the key is in how we respond back to those thoughts when they pop in, okay? It's inevitable. Those thoughts will keep popping in over and over and over. And how we respond back determines whether we allow ourselves to go into a deeper state of relaxation or whether we kind of resist it. And so the trick is in noticing those impulsive, reactive thoughts of self-doubt and responding consciously with a permissive reply back to those thoughts. And just doing that over and over and over again. Now here's what I think is the most helpful analogy to think about how to respond to those reactive or impulsive thoughts, okay? Imagine that you are holding within your arms yourself as a baby, okay? So you're holding yourself as a baby in your own arms. And then the baby that you're holding, every time those reactive thoughts of self-doubt, those impulsive thoughts keep popping in, that's like the baby becoming restless, fidgety, distressed. Maybe it's crying or even screaming. Not because it's necessarily hungry, just because it's feeling uncomfortable or unsafe. So how do you reply? How do you respond back when the baby starts screaming or squirming? See, in our ordinary everyday way of thinking, what most people do is we reach for a dummy, a pacifier, to kind of shut the baby up, to numb those feelings. That's what we ordinarily do in everyday life. We just don't realize that we're doing it. Or what some people do is they might kind of pull out the rattle and distract the baby with, oh, look at this, look at the rattle, okay? We frequently distract ourselves with things, again, to kind of avoid having to confront those more uncomfortable feelings. Or what some people will do is just say, here, go to your mum or go to your dad. Just totally push the baby aside, or just let it sit there and neglect it and just hope, pretend that the screaming stops. We deal with those feelings and those thoughts of self-doubt in all sorts of different ways, but very rarely do we give the baby what the baby actually really wants, which is not to be numbed or distracted or neglected, but just to feel your patience and presence, just to be held and rocked and to be responded with, it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. Those feelings, it's not like it's a bad thing, like those feelings or thoughts shouldn't be there, shouldn't be allowed to be there. Oh, quickly, yuck, get rid of it, shut it up quickly before it's going to wreck everything. And unconsciously, that's what we all too frequently fall into the trap of doing when it comes to how we react to those reactions rather than respond back to those reactions. And so what I'd like you to imagine doing is, how would you respond to yourself as a baby when it starts getting fidgety or uncomfortable, starts squirming, crying, screaming? And what I'd like you to practice doing is just noticing the thoughts, noticing the feelings, just popping in, and then reacting back, knowing that the way that this feels now, it's only going to last a few minutes or so. Okay, this is not the end of the world right now. We don't need to urgently react like this. Oh my God, it's an emergency. I'm having feelings. Quickly, I've got to numb it. Okay, once we allow those feelings to just be there and give ourselves permission to just experience them and let them go, we kind of start to become bored with them. And what happens is the baby eventually starts to calm down and eventually just fall asleep. Okay, so I hope you find that way of thinking about the process to be a helpful analogy as to how you consciously respond every time you notice those reactions. Because every time you do that, every time you respond to the reaction, what happens is the baby starts to settle more and more down, and essentially you start to become deeper and deeper into that profound state of relaxation. Now, the reality is that for some people, this is going to be a lot more challenging at first, but it's only at first. And what I guarantee you is that the more you practice and the more you persevere with this process, the easier it becomes and the faster you'll be able to experience that profound state of relaxation we call clinical hypnosis. I remember the first time that I was on the receiving end of doing some hypnosis. I was with a therapist who, I was really intimidated. It's really scary at first when you don't have a solid understanding about it. It kind of feels like, oh my God, what if I lose control and I start doing also, what if I start dancing like a chicken, or what if they have control over my mind or something? But you know what? It's nothing like that at all. It's not even close. You are completely and utterly aware, fully in control the entire time. If anything, you are more in control, okay? You are more aware of yourself and your surroundings than you would ordinarily be. And I remember that by the very end of it, when I was hearing the voice saying, okay, it's time to open your eyes now, and I was like, oh, come on, can I just stay here for a couple more minutes? So it's a very pleasant, peaceful, and very obviously relaxing state. So there's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, uncertain, or intimidated about. If anything, after you've experienced that profound state of relaxation, the first thing you'll want to do is probably go back and do it over and over again. So keep that in mind moving forward, that it's nothing to worry about. If anything, it's actually a really great experience. It's also important to realize that doing the process of hypnosis, whilst that is a very therapeutic process, okay, it's very good to be able to learn how to slow your mind down and become more relaxed, and you can become more clear, more focused, more aware. That is a therapeutic process, but that process in itself is not the therapy, okay? Psychotherapy plus hypnosis is what hypnotherapy is all about. So it's not like you just go into the relaxed state and then the therapist says, okay, from now on, you're going to be healthy, happy, confident, and you're never going to worry again, and everything's going to be wonderful, and that's it. You just open your eyes and boom, it's done. It's not quite that simple. There's still the need to do actual talk therapy as well, and for that reason, it's important to see someone who A, knows what they're doing, B, is able and willing to adjust the form of therapy that they use that's most suitable for your personal needs, And C, when it comes to the hypnosis part of the therapy, it's important to see somebody who is able to kind of be like the band that plays the music that you already like. It just makes it that extra bit easy to be able to go along, learn the process, and get a really great outcome in as short as time as possible.
At the heart of most people's problems, you'll find a general absence of the communication of acceptance and reassurance to oneself. As a result, we numb the feelings with something on the outside to distract us away from what's going on inside. Once we learn to provide ourselves with what's missing on the inside, we eventually lose the desire to be driven towards self-destructive habits. Remember, we're always thinking repetitious patterns of thoughts anyway, so we might as well learn to practice self-compassionate thinking. Good psychotherapy therefore provides you with exercises to practice in between sessions. The most effective approach is to balance the healing of past wounds with the setting of future goals. Whether healing the past or planning for the future, either way, learning to expand our comfort zone to strengthen our weaknesses is the ultimate goal. Because the mind can be resistant or bury the solutions we need, the use of clinical hypnosis can make the process much more comfortable. Remember that clinical hypnosis is nothing like stage hypnosis. Instead, hypnosis is simply a state of profound relaxation, which gives you a much clearer perspective to see what you were previously unable to see, often providing you with aha moments of epiphany and realization. Hypnosis is not something that passively happens to you so much as it is something you can actively learn how to do. The simplest way to think of the process is that it's all about learning to respond back to the thoughts of self-doubt or feelings of uncertainty when you notice them pop into your mind. Hypnosis may be more challenging for some people to learn than for others, but everyone can learn to do the process. The irony is that the more challenging you find it, the more you have to gain by learning how to do it. Remember that doing hypnosis is actually a pleasant experience, which people generally want to repeat after they learn how to do it. In the final video for this session, Stuart explains how the concepts discussed here can be practically applied in the real world, and lets you know what the next steps are from here moving forward.